911 call was placed from a payphone on the corner of Elm and 3rd at 11:47 p.m. on October 14th. The phone company has no record of that call. The municipality removed that payphone in August, 2 years earlier. The recording exists. The woman's voice is calm. Too calm. She gives an address, says someone is hurt, then hangs up. When officers arrived at the address, they found nothing. No victim. No signs of disturbance. But the call came from a phone that shouldn't exist. Notice what doesn't fit. The 911 dispatcher logged the call. The recording is clear. The phone number matches the old payphone's listed number, but the service request form from the municipality shows the payphone was decommissioned and physically removed on August 9th, 2 years before the call. The phone company confirms disconnection on that date. So how does a phone that was gone for 2 years make a call? I'm a cold case researcher. I don't work for law enforcement. I work with recorded archives, public records, and people who want to talk when the official channels have moved on. This case found me through a tip from a retired dispatcher who couldn't let it go. She sent me a zip file with the audio, the service logs, and a single note that said, "This shouldn't be possible." I started with the call itself. The woman's voice is steady. No panic, no urgency. She says, "Someone is hurt. 1247 Brookline Road. You need to send someone." Then, silence. Then the line goes dead. The dispatcher asks her to stay on the line. She doesn't respond. The call duration is 41 seconds. The address exists. It's a small rental house on the east side of town, about 3 miles from the payphone location. Officers responded within 9 minutes. They found the house dark, doors locked, no signs of forced entry. The tenant was out of town, confirmed by her employer. No one else had keys. No blood, no disturbance, no indication anyone had been there. The call was logged as a possible prank or wrong address. It was filed and forgotten. But the retired dispatcher kept the file. She told me she played the recording dozens of times over the years. She said the woman's voice sounded practiced, like she was reading from a script. She said the silence after the address felt wrong, not like someone hanging up in fear, but like someone waiting to make sure the message was received. I pulled the municipality records. The payphone at Elm and 3rd was part of a city-wide removal project. Budget cuts, declining usage, vandalism. 17 payphones were decommissioned that summer. The service request form lists August 9th as the removal date. I contacted the phone company. They confirmed disconnection on that date and provided the work order. The physical unit was hauled to a recycling facility. There is no ambiguity in the records. So I went to the corner. The concrete pad is still there. 4 bolt holes where the housing was anchored. A faded rectangular outline from years of weather. I stood there in the rain and tried to imagine how a disconnected, removed phone could place a call 2 years later. I couldn't. I started interviewing people. The neighborhood around Elm and 3rd is quiet, mostly older homes, a few small businesses that close by 8. I spoke to a woman who runs a dry cleaning shop across the street. She remembers the payphone. She said it was used mostly by workers from the rail yard a few blocks over. She said it was removed in the summer, she's sure of it, because she remembers the crew taking it down. She watched from her window. I asked if she remembered anything unusual around the time of the call. She paused. She said there was a woman who used to use that phone regularly, always late at night. She never saw her face clearly, just someone in a dark coat, standing under the streetlight, talking quietly. She said the woman stopped coming around after the phone was removed. She assumed she'd found another way to make calls. I asked when she last saw the woman. She said maybe a week before the phone was removed. I asked if she'd seen her after. She said no. Then she said, but I heard the phone ring once after it was gone. She said it was late, maybe October, 2 years ago. She was locking up the shop. She heard a phone ringing from across the street. She looked over. There was no phone, just the empty pad. She said she thought she was imagining it. I pulled the 911 logs for that week. October 14th was the only call from that number in a 2-year window. I cross-referenced it with other reports. Nothing. No similar calls. No other anomalies. Just that 1 41-second call from a phone that didn't exist. I went to the address, 1247 Brookline Road. The tenant who lived there at the time of the call has since moved. I tracked her down through property records. Her name is Angela Marsh. She agreed to talk to me over the phone. She said she was out of town that night, visiting her sister 3 hours away. She said the police called her the next day to ask if she was okay. She had no idea what they were talking about. She said no one else had keys to the house. She said nothing was missing or disturbed when she returned. I asked if she knew anyone who might have used her address. She said no. I asked if she'd received any strange calls or visitors before that night. She said no. Then she said, but there was a woman who used to call me from a payphone. She said it started about 6 months before the 911 call. The woman would call, always late, always from the same number, the one at Elm and 3rd. She'd asked to speak to someone named Claire. Angela would tell her there was no Claire at this number. The woman would apologize and hang up. It happened maybe a dozen times. Angela said she stopped answering calls from that number. Then the calls stopped. I asked when the calls stopped. She said around the time the payphone was removed. I asked if the woman ever left a message. She said no. I asked if she recognized the voice. She paused. She said, when the police played me the 911 recording, I wondered if it was the same voice, but I couldn't be sure. So now I have a woman who called the same number repeatedly, asking for someone who didn't exist, from a payphone that was later removed. And then, 2 years after the phone was gone, a call was placed from that same number to 911, giving the same address, saying someone was hurt, but no one was there. I went back to the phone company. I requested detailed records for the number. They sent me a spreadsheet. The last registered call from that number was on August 8th, the day before disconnection. The call was to a local number. I traced it. It belonged to a residential line, disconnected 5 years ago. Dead end. I requested the removal work order. It lists the crew, the supervisor, the time, the location. I contacted the supervisor. He's retired now. He said he remembers the job. He said the payphone was in good condition when they removed it. He said there was nothing unusual about it. I asked if anyone could have tampered with it before removal. He said it's possible, but unlikely. The units are locked, and the phone company tracks access I asked if he remembered anyone using the phone around the time of removal. He said no. I asked if he remembered a woman in a dark coat. He said no. I asked if anything about the job stood out. He said, "The only thing I remember is that the phone was still plugged in when we got there. Usually, the phone company disconnects the line first, then we remove the unit. But this one was still live. We had to wait for the phone company to cut the line before we could take it down." I asked when the line was cut. He said during the job, mid-morning. I asked if anyone could have made a call after that. He said no. Once the line is cut, the phone is dead. So the phone was live until mid-morning on August 9th. It was removed that afternoon. The phone company confirms disconnection at 10:32 a.m. on August 9th. After that, the number was deactivated. No calls should have been possible. I went back to the 911 recording. I listened to it again, this time with headphones, in a quiet room. I heard something I missed before. In the background, very faint, there's a sound. It's rhythmic, like machinery, or maybe a train. The rail yard is 2 blocks from the payphone location. I pulled train schedules for October 14th. A freight train passed through at 11:43 p.m., 4 minutes before the call was placed. I listened again. The sound matches. The call was made from a location near the rail yard, but the phone was gone. So where did the call come from? I started looking into the woman, the one who called Angela Marsh, asking for Claire. I pulled phone records for Angela's number, going back 2 years before the 911 call. There were 14 calls from the Elm and 3rd payphone number, all between 10 p.m. and midnight, all lasting less than 30 seconds. The last one was on August 7th, 2 days before the phone was removed. I cross-referenced those dates with other records. Nothing. I searched for anyone named Claire connected to that address or the phone number. Nothing. I searched for missing persons reports around that time. Nothing matched. I contacted the police department that responded to the 911 call. They pulled the file. It's thin. The responding officers noted no signs of disturbance, no victim, no evidence of a crime. The case was closed as unfounded. I asked if they followed up. They said no. The tenant was out of town. No one else reported anything. It didn't meet the threshold for further investigation. I asked if they investigated the phone itself. They said no. The call came in. They responded. That's protocol. The dispatcher flagged the payphone number as unusual, but it wasn't pursued. I asked why. They said the call didn't result in a crime scene. Without a victim or evidence, there was no case to investigate. So I'm left with a recording, a service request form with conflicting implications, and a woman who may or may not exist. I decided to go back to the beginning. I pulled every public record I could find for the address, the phone number, and the surrounding area. I looked for patterns, connections, anything that might explain how a disconnected phone made a call 2 years after it was removed. I found one thing. A missing person report filed 3 years before the 911 call. A woman named Claire Dawson, age 31, last seen near the rail yard. She never came home. Her car was found 2 days later, parked near Elm and 3rd, just a few yards from the payphone. She was never found. The case went cold. I pulled everything I could on Claire Dawson. She worked at a packaging plant near the rail yard. She lived alone, about a mile from Brookline Road. She had no close family. A few friends, none of whom reported seeing her the night she disappeared. The police investigated. They interviewed co-workers, checked her financial records, searched the area. Nothing. She vanished. I looked at the dates. Claire disappeared on October 12th, 3 years before the 911 call. The 911 call was placed on October 14th, 2 years later, same month, 2 days apart. I pulled the original missing person file. The last known location was near the payphone. The last known activity was a call from that payphone to an unknown number. The call was never traced. I went back to the 911 recording. I listened to the voice again. I tried to imagine Claire Dawson's voice. I had no reference. There were no recordings in the file. I contacted her former employer. They had no records. I contacted her landlord. He remembered her as quiet, kept to herself, paid rent on time. He said she never caused trouble. He said he was surprised when she disappeared. He said it didn't fit. I asked if he knew anyone named Angela Marsh. He said no. I asked if Claire ever mentioned Brookline Road. He said he didn't remember. I asked if she used payphones regularly. He said he didn't know. I asked if she seemed scared or worried before she disappeared. He paused. He said, she asked me to change the locks a few weeks before she went missing. She said she felt like someone had been in her apartment. I changed them. She never said anything else about it. I asked if he reported that to the police. He said yes, it's in the file. I went back to the file. It's noted, but not pursued. No evidence of forced entry. No signs of disturbance. She was listed as a possible runaway or voluntary missing person. The case went cold within 6 months. So now I have a missing woman who used the same payphone, who disappeared near the same location, who asked for new locks before she vanished. And 2 years later, a call is placed from that same phone, which no longer exists, to an address connected to someone who received calls from that phone, asking for a woman named Claire. I don't have answers yet. I have a timeline that doesn't work, a phone that shouldn't be able to make calls, and a voice that may belong to someone who's been missing for 5 years. I have pressure building in my chest every time I listen to that recording, because I know something is wrong, and I don't yet understand what. I'm going back to the rail yard tomorrow. I'm going to walk the area, talk to workers, see if anyone remembers anything. I'm going to find out who Claire Dawson called from that payphone the night she disappeared. I'm going to trace every call, every connection, every gap in the records, because a phone that doesn't exist placed a call, and someone heard it, and I need to know who and why and what they were trying to say. This is the start, the rupture, the moment the case stops being a file and becomes something alive, something that pushes back. I'll keep recording, I'll keep pulling threads, and I'll find out what happened to Claire Dawson and why her name keeps surfacing in a case that shouldn't exist. The rain hasn't stopped. I'm standing on the corner of Elm and 3rd, looking at the empty pad where the phone used to be. I'm thinking about the woman in the dark coat. I'm thinking about the calls Angela Marsh received. I'm thinking about the 41 seconds of audio that shouldn't exist. And I'm wondering if the phone is really gone, or if it's just waiting. Tomorrow, I'll start pulling the rest apart. Tonight, I'm recording this so there's a record. because I have the feeling this case doesn't want to be solved. It wants to stay buried. But I'm not backing away. Not yet. The timeline is broken. The phone is gone. The woman is missing. And somewhere in the gap between those facts, there's a truth that someone tried very hard to erase. I'm going to find it. I went back to the rail yard the next morning. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy, like the storm was just waiting to return. The rail yard is industrial. Chain link fences, rusted freight cars, workers in high-vis vests moving between tracks. I talked to the shift supervisor, a man named Dennis Cole, who's been there for 12 years. I asked him if he remembered Claire Dawson. He said the name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. I showed him a photo from the missing person file. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Yeah, I remember her. She worked at the packaging plant across the tracks. She used to walk through here sometimes on her way home. Late shift." I asked if he remembered the night she disappeared. He said he wasn't working that night, but he heard about it later. I asked if anyone saw her that night. He said not that he knew of. I asked if there were security cameras. He said there were, but the footage was only kept for 30 days. By the time the police asked, it was gone. I asked if he remembered anything unusual around that time. He paused. He said there was a guy who used to hang around the yard at night. Not a worker, just someone who showed up, walked the perimeter, sometimes sat on the benches near the fence. Dennis said he ran him off a few times, told him it wasn't a public space. The guy never caused trouble, just made people uncomfortable. I asked when he last saw him. Dennis said maybe a few weeks before Claire disappeared. Then he stopped coming around. I asked for a description. Dennis said average height, dark jacket, always wore a cap pulled low. Never got a good look at his face. I asked if he reported it to the police. Dennis said no. The guy never did anything illegal, just loitering. I asked if anyone else might remember him. Dennis gave me the name of a night crew worker, a man named Louis Vega, who'd been there longer. I found Luis on his lunch break, sitting on a concrete barrier near the tracks. I asked him about the guy who used to hang around. Luis nodded immediately. He said, "Yeah, I remember him. Creepy dude, always watching." I told Dennis to call the cops, but he said the guy wasn't breaking any laws. I asked if he ever spoke to the guy. Luis said no. He said the guy never talked to anyone, just stood there, looking at the plant across the tracks. I asked if he saw him the night Claire disappeared. Luis said he didn't work that night, but he worked the night before. He said the guy was there. He said he remembers because it was the last time he saw him. I asked if he saw Claire that night. Luis said no. He said he saw her a few times over the years, walking home after her shift. He said she always looked like she was in a hurry, head down, hands in her pockets. He said he never saw her talk to anyone. I asked if he ever saw her use the payphone. He said maybe, but he couldn't be sure. There were a lot of people who used that phone. I asked if he remembered anything else about the guy. Luis said, "One time, I saw him writing something in a notebook, just standing there under the streetlight, writing. I thought maybe he was sketching the rail yard or something, but it seemed off." I asked when that was. Luis said a few months before Claire disappeared. I asked if he ever saw the notebook again. Louis said no. I asked if he'd be willing to talk to the police about it now. Louis shook his head. He said, "What's the point? It's been 5 years. The guy's long gone." I thanked him and walked back toward Elm and 3rd. I was thinking about the man in the dark jacket, the notebook, the way he watched the plant. I was thinking about Claire walking home late at night, feeling like someone had been in her apartment, asking for new locks. I was thinking about the calls Angela Marsh received, the woman asking for Claire. I went to the packaging plant. It's a low concrete building with small windows and a loading dock. I asked to speak to the manager. A woman named Sandra Epps came out to meet me. I explained I was researching Claire Dawson's disappearance. She said she remembered Claire. She said she was a good worker, reliable, quiet. She said it was a shock when she didn't show up for her shift. I asked if Claire had any problems at work. Sandra said no. I asked if she had any conflicts with co-workers. Sandra said not that she knew of. I asked if anyone at the plant seemed overly interested in Claire. Sandra hesitated. She said, "There was one guy. He worked shipping. He used to ask about her schedule, when she'd be working, that kind of thing." It made some of the other women uncomfortable. I asked his name. Sandra said his name was Derek Pullman. She said he left the plant about a month after Claire disappeared. I asked why. Sandra said he just stopped showing up. She said they tried to contact him, but his phone was disconnected. She said they never got an explanation. I asked if the police talked to him. Sandra said she didn't know. She said she told the detective who came by about Derek, but she never heard anything after that. I pulled the missing person file again. There's no mention of Derek Pullman. I contacted the detective who worked the case. He's retired now, living 2 hours north. I called him. His name is Frank Halloran. He said he remembered the case. He said it was frustrating because there was no evidence of foul play, no leads, no witnesses. He said they followed up on everything they had, but it all went nowhere. I asked if he interviewed Derek Pullman. He said the name didn't sound familiar. I asked if anyone at the plant mentioned him. Frank said he'd have to check his notes, but he didn't remember. I asked if he still had the notes. He said he might have some boxes in his garage. He said he'd look and get back to me. I went back to Angela Marsh. I called her again and asked if she knew Derek Pullman. She said no. I asked if she ever felt like she was being watched or followed. She said no. I asked if she knew why someone would use her address in a 911 call. She said she had no idea. She said the whole thing felt like a mistake, like someone got the address wrong. But I kept thinking about the calls she received, the woman asking for Claire. If it was a mistake, why did it happen a dozen times? Why always from the same payphone? Why always late at night? I pulled Derek Pullman's employment records from the plant. I got his last known address. It's a small apartment complex on the south side of town. I went there. The building manager said Derek moved out 5 years ago, right after he stopped showing up for work. He said Derek left no forwarding address. He said he kept some of Derek's belongings in storage for a few months, then threw them out when Derek never came back. I asked what kind of belongings. The manager said mostly junk. Clothes, some kitchen stuff, a few boxes. I asked if there was anything unusual. He thought for a moment. He said there was a box of papers. I glanced through it before I tossed it. Looked like phone records, receipts, that kind of thing. I didn't think much of it." End quote. I asked if he remembered anything specific. He said no. I asked if he kept any records of tenants. He said he had lease agreements going back 10 years. I asked if I could see Derek's. He said he'd have to dig it out, but he could make a copy. I waited. He came back with a photocopy of the lease. It listed Derek Pullman, a local phone number, and an emergency contact. The emergency contact was a woman named Gina Pullman, listed as his sister. I asked if the manager ever met her. He said no. I ran the phone number. It was disconnected. I ran Gina Pullman's name. I found a current address in a town about an hour away. I called. No answer. I left a message explaining I was researching Claire Dawson's disappearance and wanted to talk about her brother. I didn't hear back. I decided to drive out there. The address was a small house on a quiet street. I knocked. A woman in her 40s answered. I asked if she was Gina Pullman. She said yes. I explained who I was and why I was there. She didn't invite me in. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed. I asked if she knew Claire Dawson. She said no. I asked if her brother ever mentioned her. She said she didn't know. She said she and Derek weren't close. I asked when she last spoke to him. She said maybe 6 years ago. I asked where he was now. She said she didn't know. She said he just disappeared. She said she filed a missing person report, but the police never found him. I asked when he disappeared. She said around the same time Claire Dawson did. I felt my chest tighten. I asked if the police connected the two cases. She said no. She said they treated Derek as a voluntary missing person. She said he had a history of moving around, cutting ties. She said the police didn't think there was anything suspicious about it. I asked if Derek ever seemed obsessed with anyone. Gina looked at me for a long time. Then she said, he had problems. He fixated on people sometimes. Women, usually. He convinced himself they were interested in him, even when they weren't. It caused trouble a few times. I asked what kind of trouble. She said he got fired from a job once for harassing a co-worker. She said another time, a woman filed a restraining order against him. I asked if she had details. She said no. She said Derek never talked about it. She said she only found out because the police showed up at her door once, asking if she knew where he was. I asked if she ever heard the name Claire Dawson. She said no. I asked if Derek ever mentioned working at a packaging plant. She said she thought he worked there for a while, but she wasn't sure. I asked if he ever mentioned the rail yard or the payphone at Elm and 3rd. She said no. I asked if she had any of Derek's belongings. She said no. She said when he disappeared, she went to his apartment, but the manager had already cleared it out. I asked if she kept anything. She said just a few photos. I asked if I could see them. She hesitated, then went inside. She came back with a small envelope. She handed it to me. There were 3 photos. One was a family photo. Derek as a teenager with Gina and their parents. One was Derek in his 20s, standing in front of a car. The third was Derek at what looked like a company picnic. I looked closer. In the background, I could see the packaging plant, and standing near the edge of the frame, barely visible, was a woman in a dark jacket. I couldn't see her face, but the build matched Claire Dawson's. I asked if I could keep the photo. Gina said no. I asked if I could take a picture of it. She said fine. I used my phone. I thanked her and left. I went home and enlarged the image on my computer. The woman in the background was facing away, but the jacket, the posture, the hair length, it all matched the description of Claire. I couldn't be certain, but it was enough to keep going. I went back to Frank Halloran. I called him again. He said he found his notes. He said he'd looked through them and didn't see any mention of Derek Pullman. I asked how that was possible if Sandra Epps told him about Derek. Frank said he didn't remember Sandra mentioning anyone specific. He said it was possible the information got lost in the shuffle. He said the case had a lot of dead ends, and they prioritized leads that seemed more solid. I asked if he'd be willing to reopen the case. Frank said he was retired, and it wasn't his call. I asked if he could at least flag it to the current department. He said he'd make a call, but he couldn't promise anything. I contacted the police department myself. I explained what I'd found. I gave them Derek Pullman's name, the connection to Claire, the timing of his disappearance. They said they'd look into it. They said if there was enough to justify reopening the case, they'd let me know. I didn't hear back. I kept digging. I pulled every record I could find on Derek Pullman. Employment history, addresses, phone records. I found 3 prior addresses, all within a 10-mile radius. I found 2 previous jobs. Both ended abruptly. I found a court record for a restraining order filed 7 years ago by a woman named Jessica Lane. I tracked her down. Jessica agreed to talk over the phone. She said Derek worked with her at a retail store. She said he started showing up at her apartment, leaving notes on her car, calling her late at night. She said he was convinced they were meant to be together, even though she'd never given him any indication she was interested. She said she filed the restraining order after he followed her home from work one night and wouldn't leave. I asked if he ever hurt her. She said no. She said he never threatened her, never touched her. She said he just wouldn't stop. She said it felt like he was always there, always watching. I asked how long it lasted. She said a few months. Then the restraining order went through, and he stopped. I asked if he ever mentioned anyone else. She said no. I asked if he ever talked about his work at the packaging plant. She said he mentioned it once, said he liked it better than the retail job. I asked if he ever seemed violent. She said no. She said he seemed lost, like he didn't know how to connect with people. She said it was sad, but also scary. I thanked her and hung up. I was starting to build a picture of Derek Pullman, a man who fixated on women, who couldn't take rejection, who disappeared at the same time as Claire Dawson, a man who worked at the same plant, who knew her schedule, who had a history of obsessive behavior, a man who might have been the one hanging around the rail yard at night, watching. But I still didn't know how any of this connected to the 911 call. Derek disappeared 5 years ago. The call was placed 2 years ago. If Derek was responsible for Claire's disappearance, who made the call? And why use a phone that didn't exist? I went back to the phone company. I explained the situation and asked if there was any way a disconnected line could be reactivated without their knowledge. They said no. They said once a line is disconnected, it's deactivated in their system. They said the number could be reassigned to a new line, but there would be records. I asked if the Elman third number had been reassigned. They checked. They said no. The number had been retired. I asked if someone could spoof a phone number to make it look like a call was coming from a disconnected line. They said technically, yes, but it would require equipment and knowledge. They said it wasn't something a casual user could do. I asked if there were any records of spoofed calls from that number. They said they wouldn't have that information. I'd have to contact law enforcement. I contacted the police again. I explained the spoofing possibility. They said they'd look into it, but spoofed calls are notoriously hard to trace. They said unless there was a clear suspect, it would be difficult to pursue. I kept thinking about the voice in the 911 recording. Calm, deliberate, practiced. I kept thinking about the timing. October 14th, 2 days after Claire disappeared. October 14th, 2 years later, the 911 call. Same month, same day offset. It felt intentional. I pulled the calendar. October 12th, 5 years ago, was a Thursday. Claire disappeared after her shift, sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight. October 14th, 2 years ago, was a Saturday. The 911 call came in at 11:47 p.m. I looked at the pattern. 2 days after the disappearance. 2 years later. A call from a phone that shouldn't exist to an address that received calls asking for Claire. I started thinking about Angela Marsh again. I called her one more time. I asked if she was home on October 14th, the night of the 911 call. She said she was out of town, visiting her sister. I asked if anyone else had access to her house. She said no. I asked if she'd given her address to anyone. She said no. I asked if she'd ever met Derek Pullman. She said she didn't think so. I sent her the photo from the company picnic. She looked at it and said she didn't recognize him. I asked if she'd ever seen him around her neighborhood. She said she didn't think so, but she couldn't be sure. I asked if she still lived at the same address. She said no. She moved about a year after the 911 call. She said the whole thing made her uncomfortable, even though nothing happened. She said she didn't feel safe there anymore. I asked where she lived now. She said about 20 miles away, a different town. I asked if she'd had any more strange calls or incidents. She said no. Everything had been quiet since she moved. I thanked her and hung up. I was running out of leads. I had Derek Pullman, a man with a history of obsession who disappeared at the same time as Claire. I had a 911 call from a phone that didn't exist, placed 2 years later. I had a voice that might belong to Claire, or might belong to someone pretending to be her. I had an address that seemed random, except for the calls asking for Claire. I decided to go back to the beginning. I went to Claire's last known address. The landlord said the apartment had been rented out twice since Claire disappeared. I asked if I could see it. He said the current tenant might not appreciate that. I asked if he remembered anything unusual about the apartment after Claire left. He said no. He said the police searched it, found nothing, and released it back to him. He said he cleaned it out, repainted, and rented it again. I asked what he did with Claire's belongings. He said he boxed them up and put them in storage, in case she came back or her family claimed them. I asked if anyone ever did. He said no. I asked if he still had the boxes. He said he thought so. He said he'd have to check the storage unit. He called me the next day. He said he found 2 boxes. He said I could look through them if I wanted. I met him at the storage facility. He opened the unit. and pulled out 2 cardboard boxes. He said he hadn't looked inside in years. I opened the first box. Clothes, shoes, a few books. Nothing unusual. I opened the second box. More personal items. A jewelry box, some framed photos, a stack of papers. I went through the papers. Bills, pay stubs, a lease agreement. Then I found something. A notebook. It was small, spiral bound, the kind you'd pick up at a drugstore. I opened it. The pages were filled with handwriting, notes, phone numbers, addresses. I scanned through it. Most of it was mundane. Grocery lists, work schedules, reminders. Then I found the section that stopped me. It was dated about a month before Claire disappeared. The entry said, "He was outside again. I saw him from the window. Same guy, same jacket. I don't know what he wants." A few pages later, called the cops. They said they'd send someone to check. Nobody showed up. A few pages later, changed the locks today. Landlord thinks I'm paranoid. Maybe I am, but I keep seeing him. The last entry was dated October 10th, 2 days before she disappeared. It said, "I think he knows where I work. I saw him near the plant today. I'm going to talk to Sandra tomorrow. Maybe she can switch my shift." I read it again. I took photos of every page. I closed the notebook and put it back in the box. I thanked the landlord and left. I had it now. Claire knew someone was watching her. She reported it to the police, but they didn't follow up. She changed her locks. She was scared. And 2 days after that last entry, she disappeared. I went back to Frank Halloran. I told him about the notebook. He said he didn't remember seeing it. He said it was possible it was in the apartment when they searched. But if it didn't seem relevant at the time, it might not have been logged. He said a lot of things fall through the cracks in missing person cases, especially when there's no evidence of a crime. I asked if he could push the current department to reopen the case. He said he'd try. He said with the notebook and the connection to Derek Pullman, there might be enough. He said he'd make some calls. I waited. Days passed. Then I got a call from a detective named Sarah Linden. She said she was reviewing Claire Dawson's case. She said she'd read my notes and seen the notebook. She said they were looking into Derek Pullman. She said it would take time, but they were treating it seriously now. I asked if they'd found anything on Derek. She said not yet. She said his trail went cold 5 years ago. She said they were checking databases, contacting other jurisdictions, seeing if his name showed up anywhere. She said if he was alive, they'd find him. If he wasn't, they'd find that too. I asked about the 911 call. She said they were still trying to figure out how it was made. She said the spoofing angle was possible, but they hadn't found evidence of it yet. She said they were working with the phone company to trace the technical side. She said it might take a while. I asked if I could keep investigating on my own. She said as long as I didn't interfere with their work. She said if I found anything, I should bring it to her first. I said I would. I kept going. I pulled every piece of information I could find on Derek Pullman. I looked at his social media, but he didn't have much presence online. A few old profiles, nothing active in years. I looked at his financial records. His bank account was closed a month after he disappeared. The last transaction was a cash withdrawal of $300. I looked at his phone records. The last call he made was on October 13th, 5 years ago, the day after Claire disappeared. The call was to a local number. I traced it. It belonged to a prepaid cell phone, no longer in service. Dead end. I kept thinking about the timing. Derek disappeared the day after Claire. His last call was to an unknown number. Claire's last notebook entry was 2 days before she disappeared. It all lined up. I started thinking about the 911 call again. The voice, the calm delivery, the address. If someone was trying to send a message, what was it? I pulled the 911 recording one more time. I listened to it on a loop. The woman says, "Someone is hurt. 1247 Brookline Road. You need to send someone." Then silence. Then the line goes dead. I focused on the word choice. Not someone's hurt, but someone is hurt. Present tense. Not I need help, but you need to send someone. Detached. Like she's reporting something, not experiencing it. I thought about Angela Marsh's address. Why that address? Angela said she had no connection to Claire. But the calls Angela received, the woman asking for Claire, those calls came from the same payphone. So someone connected Claire to that address. Someone who knew Claire was missing. Someone who wanted people to look there. But the police did look. They found nothing. So what was the point? Unless the point wasn't to find something at Angela's house, maybe the point was to create a record of a call, a record of a connection, a record that would surface later, when someone started asking questions. I called Sarah Linden. I told her my theory. She listened. She said it was possible. She said it would mean someone planned this years in advance. She said that level of premeditation suggested someone who knew how investigations worked. Someone who knew how to manipulate records, create false leads, stay ahead of the process. I asked if that fit Derek Pullman's profile. She said, not really. She said Derek had a history of impulsive behavior, fixation, poor judgment. She said premeditated manipulation wasn't his style. She said it was possible he had help, or he learned, or she was wrong about the theory. I asked if there was anyone else who fit the profile. She said she'd have to think about it. She said she'd look at everyone connected to the case. She said if there was someone else, they'd find them. I hung up and sat in my car for a long time. The rain had started again. I watched it run down the windshield and thought about Claire Dawson, walking home late at night, feeling watched. I thought about Derek Pullman, fixated and obsessive, disappearing the day after she did. I thought about the 911 call, the calm voice, the impossible phone. I thought about the woman in the dark coat, the one who used the payphone late at night, the one the dry cleaning shop owner saw, the one who stopped coming around after the phone was removed. I thought about the calls to Angela Marsh, always late, always asking for Claire. And I realized I'd been thinking about it wrong. I'd been assuming the woman on the 911 call was Claire, or someone pretending to be Claire. But what if it wasn't? What if it was someone else? Someone who knew Claire. Someone who knew what happened to her. Someone who was trying to tell the story 2 years later from a phone that didn't exist. I started pulling every detail I could find about the woman who used the payphone. The dry cleaning shop owner said she saw her regularly, always late at night, always in a dark coat. She said the woman stopped coming after the phone was removed, but she also said she heard the phone ring once after it was gone, in October 2 years ago. I went back to the shop. The owner's name is Margaret Hines. She's been running the place for 20 years. I asked if she'd be willing to look at some photos, see if she recognized anyone. She said sure. I showed her Claire Dawson's photo. Margaret looked at it carefully. She said, "I don't think that's her. The woman I saw was taller, I think, and her hair was different, darker, longer." I showed her a photo of Gina Pullman. Margaret shook her head. I asked if she could describe the woman in more detail. Margaret said she only ever saw her from across the street, through the window. She said the woman always stood with her back to the shop, facing the phone. She said she never saw her face clearly. I asked if the woman ever arrived in a car. Margaret said she didn't know. She said by the time she noticed her, the woman was already at the phone. I asked if anyone else ever used the phone at the same time. Margaret said not usually. She said most people used it during the day. The woman was one of the few regulars at night. I asked if Margaret ever heard what the woman was saying. Margaret laughed. She said no, the shop windows are thick and the street noise is too loud. I asked if the woman ever seemed distressed. Margaret thought about it. She said no. She said the woman always seemed calm, composed. She said that's part of what made it strange. She said most people who use that phone late at night seemed like they were in trouble or in a hurry. But this woman just stood there, talking quietly, like she had all the time in the world. I asked if Margaret remembered the last time she saw the woman before the phone was removed. She said it was maybe a week before the removal. She said she remembered because the woman stood there for a long time that night, longer than usual. She said she must have been on the phone for 20 minutes. I asked if she saw the woman after the phone was removed. Margaret said no. Just that one time she heard the phone ring, in October. She said she looked out the window and there was nobody there. She said she almost went outside to check, but she didn't. She said she told herself she was hearing things. I asked what time that was. Margaret said late, maybe 11 or midnight. I asked if it was October 14th. She said she didn't remember the exact date, but it was around then. I asked if she told anyone about it. She said no. She said it seemed crazy. I thanked her and left. I kept thinking about the woman. Tall, dark hair, dark coat, always calm, always at night. I started wondering if the woman was connected to Derek or if she was someone else entirely. I went back to the phone company records. I pulled the call logs for the Elm and Third payphone for the 6 months before it was disconnected. There were hundreds of calls. I started going through them, looking for patterns. Most were short, a few minutes. Some were to local numbers, some were long distance. I focused on the calls made late at night. There were 37 calls made between 10 p.m. and midnight in the 6 months before disconnection. I cross-referenced them with the dates Margaret said she saw the woman. 14 of those calls matched the time frame. I pulled the numbers. Most were to residential lines. A few were to businesses. None were to Angela Marsh's number during that period. The calls to Angela's number started earlier, about a year before disconnection. I started calling the numbers. Some were disconnected, some didn't answer. A few people answered, but said they didn't remember getting calls from a payphone. One man said he used to get calls from his sister, who didn't have a home phone. I asked if his sister was tall with dark hair. He said no, she was short and blonde. Dead end. I kept going. Then I found something. One of the numbers belonged to a woman named Karen Lyle. She answered on the third ring. I explained who I was and asked if she remembered getting calls from the Elm and Third payphone. She said yes. She said her friend used to call her from there. I asked her friend's name. Karen said, Rachel. Rachel Cody. She lived a few blocks from that payphone. She didn't have a cell phone, so she used the payphone when she needed to make calls. I asked if Rachel was tall with dark hair. Karen said yes. I felt my pulse quicken. I asked if Rachel was still in town. Karen said no. She said Rachel moved away about 4 years ago. I asked where. Karen said she didn't know exactly. She said they lost touch after Rachel left. I asked if Rachel ever mentioned Claire Dawson. Karen said the name didn't ring a bell. I asked if Rachel ever mentioned the packaging plant or the rail yard. Karen said no. I asked if Rachel ever seemed worried or scared about anything. Karen paused. She said, actually, yeah. Toward the end, before she moved, she seemed really on edge. She said she felt like someone was following her. I told her to go to the police, but she said she didn't have proof. I asked if Rachel ever said who she thought was following her. Karen said no. She said Rachel just said it was a feeling. She said Rachel started calling her more often, always late at night, always from that payphone. She said Rachel said she felt safer talking from the payphone than from her apartment. I asked when Rachel moved. Karen said it was right around the time that woman disappeared. She said she remembered because it was all over the news, and she asked Rachel if she knew her. Rachel said no, but she seemed shaken by it. I asked if Karen had any way to contact Rachel. She said she had an old phone number, but she didn't know if it still worked. She gave it to me. I thanked her and hung up. I tried the number. It was disconnected. I ran Rachel Cody's name through every database I could find. I found an old address, the one near the payphone. I found a few social media profiles, none active in years. I found a driver's license record, expired. No current address. I went to the old address. It was a small apartment building, similar to Derek's. I talked to the building manager. He said Rachel moved out about 4 years ago. He said she left no forwarding address. He said she paid her last month's rent and disappeared. I asked if he remembered anything unusual about her. He said she was quiet, kept to herself. He said she seemed nervous toward the end. He said she asked him once if anyone had been asking about her. He said no one had. I asked if she left anything behind. He said no, she took everything. I asked if he knew where she worked. He said he thought she worked at a call center, but he wasn't sure. I ran employment records. I found a listing for Rachel Cody at a call center about 2 miles from her old apartment. I went there. The call center was still in operation. I asked to speak to the manager. A man named Todd Fisher came out. I explained I was looking for information about Rachel Cody. He said he'd have to check the records. He came back a few minutes later and said Rachel worked there for about 3 years, ending 4 years ago. She quit without notice. I asked if he remembered her. he said vaguely. He said she was a good worker, reliable, but she kept to herself. I asked if she had any problems with anyone at work. Todd said not that he knew of. I asked if anyone ever came to the call center looking for her. Todd said he didn't remember, but he could check the visitor logs if they still existed. He came back and said the logs from that time had been purged. I asked if he remembered anything unusual about the time she quit. Todd thought about it. He said he remembered she seemed stressed toward the end. He said she called in sick a few times, which was unusual for her. He said when she quit, she just didn't show up one day. She called later and said she was leaving town. She said she'd mail her uniform back. She never did. I asked if he had any way to contact her. He said no. I asked if any of her co-workers were still there. He said one woman, Linda Marsh, had been there since before Rachel. I asked if I could talk to her. Todd said she was on a call, but he could have her call me when she finished. Linda called me an hour later. I explained what I was looking for. She said she remembered Rachel. She said they weren't close, but they talked sometimes during breaks. I asked if Rachel ever mentioned feeling followed or scared. Linda said yes. She said Rachel told her she thought someone was watching her apartment. Linda said she asked if Rachel had called the police, and Rachel said she had, but they didn't take it seriously. I asked if Rachel ever mentioned a name. Linda said no. She said Rachel just said it was someone from her past. Linda said she got the sense Rachel was running from something or someone. I asked if Rachel ever mentioned Claire Dawson or Derek Pullman. Linda said no. I asked if Linda knew where Rachel went when she left. Linda said Rachel told her she was going to stay with family out of state, but she didn't say where. I asked if they stayed in touch. Linda said no. She said Rachel changed her number and Linda never heard from her again. I asked if Linda remembered anything else. She said one thing stuck with her. She said a few weeks before Rachel left, a man came to the call center and asked for her. Linda said she was working the front desk that day. She said the man said he was an old friend and he wanted to surprise Rachel. Linda said something about him felt off, so she told him Rachel wasn't there, even though she was. Linda said the man left, but she saw him sitting in his car in the parking lot for a while after that. I asked if Linda could describe him. She said average height, dark jacket, cap pulled low. She said she couldn't see his face clearly. I asked if she told Rachel about it. Linda said yes. She said Rachel went pale. She said Rachel left early that day and called in sick the next 2 days. Then she quit. I asked if Linda ever saw the man again. She said no. I asked if she reported it to anyone. She said no. She said Rachel asked her not to. She said Rachel said it would just make things worse. I thanked Linda and hung up. I sat in my car and tried to piece it together. Rachel Cody, tall, dark hair, used the payphone late at night, felt like she was being followed, quit her job, and left town right around the time Claire disappeared. A man showed up at her work, looking for her. The description matched the man who hung around the rail yard. The description matched Derek Pullman. But if Derek was following Rachel, why did Claire disappear? Or was he following both of them? I called Sarah Linden. I told her about Rachel Cody. She said she'd run the name, see what came up. She said if Rachel was connected to Derek or Claire, it could be significant. She said she'd get back to me. I kept thinking about the 911 call. If the voice wasn't Claire's, could it be Rachel's? Karen said Rachel called her often from that payphone. The dry cleaning shop owner said the woman who used the phone was tall with dark hair. It fit. But why would Rachel make a 911 call 2 years after she left town from a phone that didn't exist, giving an address that belonged to someone she didn't know? Unless she did know Angela Marsh. I called Angela again. I asked if she knew Rachel Cody. Angela said the name didn't sound familiar. I asked if she'd ever worked at a call center. Angela said no. I asked if she'd ever lived near Elm and 3rd. Angela said no. I was hitting walls everywhere. I decided to go back to the 911 recording. I listened to it again, this time focusing on the background noise. The train, the machinery, the faint hum. I pulled up audio editing software and isolated the background. I cleaned it up as much as I could. The train was clear. The hum was steady, mechanical. Then I heard something else, very faint, almost buried under the other sounds. A voice. Not the woman's voice. Another voice, distant, like someone talking in another room. I isolated it further. I amplified it. It was hard to make out, but I thought I heard a man's voice. I couldn't make out words, just the cadence, a low, steady tone. I played it over and over, trying to catch anything recognizable. Nothing. I sent the audio to a forensic audio specialist I'd worked with on another case. He said he'd take a look. He called me back the next day. He said the background voice was too degraded to extract clear words, but he could confirm it was male, and it sounded like it was coming from a television or radio. He said the voice didn't sound like it was in the same space as the caller. He said it was more like ambient noise from a nearby building or vehicle. I asked if he could identify the source. He said no. He said it could be anything. A TV show, a radio broadcast, someone talking on a phone. He said without more context, it was impossible to say. I thanked him and hung up. I kept thinking about the environment. The call was supposedly made from a payphone that didn't exist, but the background sounds suggested the call was made from somewhere near the rail yard. So where exactly was the caller? I went back to the rail yard. I walked the area, listening. I stood near the tracks. I could hear the hum of machinery from the plant. I could hear distant traffic. I walked toward Elm and 3rd. I stood where the payphone used to be. I listened. The sounds matched. But the payphone was gone. So where did the call come from? I looked around. Across the street was the dry cleaning shop. Next to it was a closed storefront. On the other side was a small office building. I walked to the office building. There was a directory by the door. Most of the offices were vacant. One was listed as a property management company. Another was listed as a tax preparation service. Both were closed. I walked around the building. There was a back entrance, just a metal door with no sign. I tried the handle. It was locked. I peered through a small window. It was dark inside, but I could see a hallway, some chairs, a door at the end. I went back to the front. I called the property management company. A woman answered. I explained I was researching a case and wanted to know if anyone had rented space in the building around October 2 years ago. She said she'd have to check the records. She put me on hold. She came back and said there was one tenant during that time, a small consulting firm. She said they rented a suite on the 2nd floor. I asked if they were still there. She said no. She said they moved out about a year ago. I asked if she had contact information for them. She said she'd have to get permission to release that. I left my number. She never called back. I decided to try another route. I went to the tax preparation office during business hours. A woman at the front desk greeted me. I asked if she'd been working there 2 years ago. She said, yes. I asked if she remembered anything unusual happening in October that year. She said no. I asked if she ever heard a phone ringing in the building when there shouldn't be one. She looked at me strangely. I explained I was researching an old case. She said she didn't remember anything like that. I asked if anyone else worked there who might remember. She said just her and the owner was out. I left my number and asked her to have the owner call me. He never did. I was running out of angles. I called Sarah Linden again. I asked if she'd found anything on Rachel Cody. She said she had. She said Rachel's name came up in a police report from 6 years ago, a harassment complaint. Rachel reported that a man was following her, showing up at her work, leaving notes on her car. The report listed the man's name as Derek Pullman. I felt a chill. I asked what happened with the complaint. Sarah said it was logged, but not pursued. She said Rachel declined to press charges. She said the report noted that Rachel seemed scared, but she said she just wanted it to stop. She said the police told Derek to stay away from Rachel. There was no follow-up. I asked if Rachel was connected to Claire. Sarah said she didn't see any direct connection in the files. She said they didn't work together, didn't live in the same area, didn't have mutual friends that she could find. She said it was possible they knew each other, but there was no record of it. I asked if Rachel had filed any other reports. Sarah said no. I asked if Derek had. Sarah said yes. She said Derek filed a missing person report for himself. I said that didn't make sense. Sarah said she agreed, but the report existed. She said Derek called the police and said he felt like he was being watched, that someone was trying to hurt him. He said he was going to leave town for his own safety. The report was dated October 13th, 5 years ago. The day after Claire disappeared. The day before Derek disappeared. I asked if the police followed up. Sarah said they did a wellness check. They went to Derek's apartment. He wasn't there. His car was gone. They tried calling him. No answer. They logged it and moved on. She said voluntary missing persons are low priority, especially when the person makes it clear they're leaving by choice. I asked if there was any indication Derek was actually in danger. Sarah said no. She said the report read like paranoia, or possibly a cover story. She said if Derek was involved in Claire's disappearance, reporting himself as endangered could be a way to create a false narrative. I asked if they'd found any trace of Derek since then. Sarah said no. She said his car was never found. His bank account was closed. His phone was disconnected. He vanished completely. I asked about the call he made the day after Claire disappeared, the one to the prepaid phone. Sarah said they traced the prepaid number. It was purchased at a convenience store with cash. No records. No way to track who owned it. I asked if they pulled surveillance from the store. Sarah said the footage was gone. She said it was 5 years ago, and the store only kept footage for 60 days. I was back to dead ends. I sat in my car outside the rail yard and tried to think. Claire disappeared. Derek disappeared the next day. Rachel left town around the same time. 2 years later, a 911 call was made from a phone that didn't exist. The voice might be Rachel's. The background sounds matched the area. But why? I kept coming back to the address, 1247 Brookline Road, Angela Marsh's house. The call she received, asking for Claire. Someone connected that address to Claire. Someone who knew Claire was missing. Someone who wanted attention on that address. I decided to go back to the house. Angela had moved, but I wanted to see it again. I drove to Brookline Road. The house looked the same. Small, single-story, quiet neighborhood. I parked across the street and watched. A man came out of the house next door. I got out of my car and approached him. I introduced myself and asked if he'd lived there long. He said 10 years. I asked if he remembered anything unusual happening at 1247 about 2 years ago. He said no. I asked if he knew the tenant who lived there at the time. He said he didn't know her well. She kept to herself. I asked if he ever saw anyone else at the house. He said no. I asked if he remembered the night the police came. He said yes. He said it was late, and the sirens woke him up. He looked out the window and saw the police at Angela's house. He said they were there for maybe 20 minutes. Then they left. I asked if he saw anyone else that night. He said no. I asked if he'd noticed anything strange in the days before or after. He thought about it. He said there was a car that parked on the street a few times around then. He said it wasn't from the neighborhood. He said he noticed it because it was always there late at night, and it would leave by morning. I asked if he remembered what kind of car. He said a sedan, dark color, maybe blue or black. He said he didn't get a close look. I asked if he saw who was driving. He said no. I asked if he saw it after the police came. He said no. He said it stopped showing up after that. I asked if he reported it to the police. He said no. He said it didn't seem important at the time. I thanked him and went back to my car. A car parked on the street late at night, around the time of the 911 call. Then it stopped. I called Sarah Linden. I told her. She said she'd check if any surveillance cameras in the area caught it. She said most residential streets don't have cameras, but she'd look. I kept thinking about Rachel. If she was the one making the calls to Angela, asking for Claire, that meant she knew Claire. But how? And why use Angela's address? I decided to try one more thing. I went back to the packaging plant. I asked Sandra Epps if she remembered anyone named Rachel Cody. Sandra said the name didn't sound familiar. I asked if Rachel ever worked there. Sandra said she'd have to check. She pulled up old employee records. She said no one named Rachel Cody had worked there. I asked if Claire had any close friends at the plant. Sandra said not really. She said Claire was friendly, but she didn't socialize much. I asked if Claire ever mentioned feeling scared or followed. Sandra said yes. She said Claire mentioned it to her once, maybe a month before she disappeared. She said Claire seemed really shaken. Sandra said she told Claire to go to the police, but Claire said she didn't think it would help. I asked if Claire said who was following her. Sandra said she thought it was someone from work, but she didn't want to say who. I asked if Sandra thought it was Derek. Sandra said she didn't know. She said Derek was the obvious choice, but Claire never confirmed it. I asked if anyone else at the plant seemed interested in Claire. Sandra said not that she noticed. I asked if Sandra had heard of Rachel Cody. She said no. I left the plant and sat in the parking lot. I was missing something. A connection between Claire and Rachel. A reason for the 911 call. A way to explain the phone that didn't exist. Then I thought about something Linda said. Rachel told her she thought someone was watching her apartment. Rachel changed her number. Rachel left town. Rachel felt like she was running from someone from her past. What if Rachel wasn't connected to Claire directly? What if they were both targets of the same person? What if Derek was following both of them? I pulled Derek's known movements. He worked at the plant where Claire worked. He was fired from a retail job where he harassed Jessica Lane. He filed a restraining order violation against Rachel. He disappeared the day after Claire did. What if Derek didn't just disappear? What if someone made him disappear? I called Sarah Linden. I told her my theory. She said it was possible. She said if Derek was a threat to both women, and one of them fought back, it could explain his disappearance. She said it would also explain why Rachel left town. She said if Rachel was involved in Derek's disappearance, she'd have reason to run. I asked if they'd found any evidence Derek was harmed. Sarah said no. She said without a body or a crime scene, it was all speculation. She said they were still looking, but so far, Derek's disappearance looked voluntary. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more. The 911 call felt like a confession, or a warning, or both. I went back to Karen Lyle, Rachel's friend. I called her again and asked if Rachel ever mentioned Derek Pullman. Karen said she didn't think so. I asked if Rachel ever talked about being threatened by anyone specific. Karen said Rachel was vague about it. She said Rachel would just say she had trouble with someone, but she never gave details. I asked if Rachel ever mentioned working with the police. Karen said no. She said Rachel didn't trust the police. She said Rachel had filed a complaint once, and nothing happened, so she stopped trying. I asked if Karen knew what the complaint was about. She said no. Rachel never said. I asked if Karen had any other way to reach Rachel. She said no. She said she'd tried everything. She said it was like Rachel wanted to disappear. I asked if that seemed like Rachel's personality. Karen paused. She said no. She said Rachel was careful, cautious, but she wasn't the type to just vanish. She said something must have really scared her. I asked if Rachel had family. Karen said she thought Rachel had a sister, but they weren't close. She said Rachel mentioned her once or twice, but never in detail. I asked if Karen knew the sister's name. She said she thought it was Lisa or Laura, something like that. Rachel said the sister lived out of state. I ran a search for Rachel Cody's family. I found a sister named Lauren Cody, living in a town about 4 hours away. I called her. She answered on the second ring. I explained who I was and asked if she'd be willing to talk about her sister. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Is Rachel okay?" I said I didn't know. I said I was trying to find her. Lauren said she hadn't heard from Rachel in almost 4 years. She said Rachel called her once, right before she left town, and said she needed to go away for a while. She said Rachel sounded scared. Lauren said she asked what was wrong, but Rachel wouldn't say. She just said she'd be in touch. She never was. I asked if Lauren tried to find her. She said yes. She said she called Rachel's phone, but it was disconnected. She said she went to Rachel's apartment, but the manager said she'd moved out. She said she filed a missing person report, but the police said Rachel left voluntarily, so there was nothing they could do. I asked if Rachel ever mentioned Claire Dawson or Derek Pullman. Lauren said no. I asked if Rachel ever talked about being followed or harassed. Lauren said yes. She said Rachel told her about a man who wouldn't leave her alone. She said Rachel filed a police report, but it didn't help. Lauren said she told Rachel to get a restraining order, but Rachel said it would just make things worse. I asked if Rachel ever said the man's name. Lauren said no. She said Rachel was afraid even talking about him would somehow make it worse. I asked if Lauren thought Rachel was still alive. Lauren's voice broke. She said she hoped so, but she didn't know. She said the not knowing was the worst part. I asked if Lauren would be willing to share a recent photo of Rachel. She said she'd email one. I gave her my address. She said she'd send it right away. I thanked her and hung up. The photo came through an hour later. I opened it. Rachel was tall, dark hair, serious expression. She looked like someone who carried a weight she couldn't put down. I saved the photo and sent it to Margaret at the dry cleaning shop. I asked if this was the woman she saw using the payphone. Margaret called me back. She said she couldn't be certain, but it looked like it could be her. She said the hair was right, the height seemed right. She said the only thing was the woman in the photo looked younger than the woman she remembered. But she said it had been years, and she'd only ever seen the woman from a distance, so she couldn't be sure. I sent the photo to Linda at the call center. Linda said yes, that was Rachel. I sent it to Karen. Karen said yes. I sent it to Sarah Linden. She said she'd add it to the file. I kept thinking about the 911 call. If it was Rachel's voice, what was she trying to say? Someone is hurt. 1247 Brookline Road. You need to send someone. But no one was there. The police found nothing. What if the hurt person wasn't at that address when the police arrived? What if they'd already been moved? Or what if the address was symbolic, not literal? What if Rachel was trying to point to something else? I went back to Angela Marsh. I called her again. I asked if anything unusual had happened at her house before the 911 call. She said no. I asked if she'd ever found anything strange on her property. She said no. I asked if anyone had ever broken in. She said no. I asked if she'd ever been inside any other units or houses on Brookline Road. She said just her own. I asked if she knew the neighbors well. She said not really. She said it was a quiet street. People kept to themselves. I asked if the house number meant anything to her. She said no. I asked if the numbers 1, 2, 4, 7 had any significance. She said no. I was grasping at straws. I decided to look at the number differently. 1247. I broke it down. 1247. October was the 10th month. The call came in on the 14th. Claire disappeared on the 12th. I looked at the time of the call. 11:47 p.m. 47. Again. I pulled the dates. Claire disappeared October 12th. The call was October 14th. 2 days later. 47 hours? I did the math. If Claire disappeared around midnight on October 12th, 47 hours later would be 11 p.m. on October 14th, close to the time of the call. But that was 5 years ago. The 911 call was 2 years ago. So the timing didn't match exactly, but the pattern did. 12:47, October 12th, 11:47 p.m. It felt deliberate. I called Sarah Linden. I told her about the number pattern. She said it was interesting, but not evidence. She said patterns can be coincidence. She said unless I could tie it to something concrete, it wouldn't hold up. I asked if they'd found anything new on Derek or Rachel. She said no. She said Derek's trail was still cold. She said Rachel's trail was even colder. She said without more information, both cases were stalled. I asked if she'd gotten the surveillance footage from Brookline Road. She said she'd checked. She said there were no cameras on that street. She said the nearest camera was at a gas station 3 blocks away, but the footage from 2 years ago was long gone. I asked if they'd re-interviewed Angela Marsh. She said yes. She said Angela told them the same thing she told me. She said Angela seemed genuinely confused about why her address was used. I asked if they'd checked Angela's background. Sarah said yes. She said Angela had no connection to Claire, Derek, or Rachel that they could find. She said Angela's record was clean. She said she worked as a bookkeeper, lived alone, no red flags. I thanked Sarah and hung up. I kept thinking about the voice in the recording. Calm, deliberate, practiced. Someone is hurt. Not I'm hurt. Not help me. Someone is hurt. Third person. Detached. What if the caller wasn't asking for help? What if the caller was making a statement? What if the call was a record, not a plea? I went back to the recording. I listened to it with that frame. The woman says, someone is hurt. Statement. 12:47 Brookline Road. Location. You need to send someone. Instruction. Then silence. Then the line goes dead. It sounded like a script, like the woman was reading from something, like she'd planned exactly what to say. I thought about Rachel. Linda said Rachel seemed like she was running from something. Karen said Rachel didn't trust the police. Lauren said Rachel sounded scared. If Rachel made the call, why would she do it 2 years after leaving town? What changed? I pulled the timeline again. Rachel left town 5 years ago, right after Claire disappeared and Derek disappeared. Rachel made calls to Angela Marsh's number before she left, asking for Claire. Then Rachel vanished. 2 years later, a 911 call was made from a phone that didn't exist, giving Angela's address, saying someone was hurt. 2 years. What happened in those 2 years? I started searching for any records of Rachel Cody during that time. Employment records, addresses, phone numbers, anything. Nothing. She was gone. I searched for Derek Pullman during that time. Nothing. He was gone too. I searched for any crimes in the area during that time. Missing persons, assaults, anything that might connect. I found a few cases, but none that seemed related. I kept thinking about the phone, the payphone that didn't exist, the call that came from a disconnected line. Sarah said someone could spoof a number, but it would take equipment and knowledge. Who would have that? I started researching phone spoofing. It's easier than I thought. There are apps, services, websites that let you change the caller ID. Some are legal, used for privacy. Some are used for scams. All you need is a smartphone and internet access. If someone spoofed the payphone number, they could make it look like the call came from that phone, even though it was disconnected. But why use that specific number? Why not just use a burner phone with a random number? Because the number mattered. The number connected to Claire. The number connected to Rachel. The number was part of the message. I went back to the phone company. I asked if there was any way to trace a spoofed call. They said it's very difficult. They said the actual call would come from a different number, but the caller ID would show the spoof number. They said unless law enforcement subpoenaed the records from the service used to spoof the call, there was no way to trace it. I asked Sarah Linden if they'd tried to trace it. She said they had. She said they contacted several spoofing services, but none had records of that number being used. She said it was possible the caller used a service that didn't keep logs, or used a method that left no trace. I was hitting walls again. I decided to shift focus. If the call was a message, who was it for? The police responded, but they found nothing. The call was logged and forgotten. Until I started digging. Until the retired dispatcher sent me the file. She said she couldn't let it go. She said something about the call felt wrong. What if the call wasn't for the police? What if it was for someone else? Someone who would eventually come looking. I called the retired dispatcher. Her name is Helen Ortiz. She answered right away. I asked why she kept the file all these years. She said it bothered her. She said the woman's voice was too calm. She said it sounded like the woman knew no one would be there. She said it felt like a message, not a call for help. I asked if Helen ever tried to investigate it herself. She said no. She said she mentioned it to a few officers over the years, but no one took it seriously. She said after she retired, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She said when she heard I was researching cold cases, she thought maybe I could figure it out. I asked if Helen recognized the voice. She said no. I played her Rachel's voicemail greeting that Lauren had sent me. Helen listened carefully. She said she couldn't be sure, but it sounded similar. She said the cadence was the same, the calmness. I asked if Helen had any theories. She said she thought someone made the call to create a record. She said maybe someone who couldn't go to the police directly. Someone who needed the call to exist, so that someday someone would find it and understand. I asked what she thought the message was. Helen said she thought someone was confessing, or accusing, or both. She said the address had to mean something. She said the timing had to mean something. She said it was all deliberate. I thanked Helen and hung up. I kept thinking about her words. A confession, an accusation, both. What if Rachel made the call to confess to something, or to accuse someone? What if the call was her way of leaving a trail, in case something happened to her? I went back to the timeline. Rachel left town 5 years ago. 2 years later, she made the call. Or someone made the call using her voice. But if it was Rachel, where had she been for those 2 years? And what made her decide to make the call then? I started searching for any records of Rachel Cody 2 years ago. The month of the call, October. I searched news reports, police logs, anything. Nothing. I searched for any reports of women matching Rachel's description. Nothing. I searched for any activity on Rachel's old accounts, social media, email, anything. Nothing. She'd been completely silent for years. Then I thought about something. Lauren said Rachel called her right before she left town. She said Rachel sounded scared. She said Rachel said she'd be in touch, but she never was. What if Rachel tried? What if something stopped her? I called Lauren again. I asked if she'd ever received any messages from Rachel after that call. She said no. I asked if she'd ever received anything unusual, mail, packages, anything that might have been from Rachel. Lauren said no. Then she paused. She said, "Actually, there was one thing." She said about 2 years ago she got a postcard. No return address. Just a picture of a lake. And on the back, one sentence. "I'm sorry." No signature. No date. Just those 2 words. I asked if she still had it. She said yes. She said she kept it because she thought maybe it was from Rachel, but she wasn't sure. I asked if she could send me a photo of it. She said yes. The photo came through. The postcard showed a lake, trees, mountains in the background. Generic. Could be anywhere. I looked at the postmark. It was smudged, but I could make out part of it. October, 2 years ago. The same month as the 911 call. I zoomed in on the handwriting. "I'm sorry." 2 words. Neat, careful script. I compared it to a sample of Rachel's handwriting that Lauren had sent earlier. It matched. I called Sarah Linden. I told her about the postcard. She said it was significant. She said if Rachel sent it in October, 2 years ago, that meant she was still alive then. She said it also meant Rachel felt guilty about something. I asked if they could trace the postcard. Sarah said it would be difficult. She said the postmark was too degraded to identify a specific location. She said the image on the postcard was generic, could be sold in hundreds of places. She said without more information, it was a dead end. But it wasn't a dead end to me. It was confirmation. Rachel was alive 2 years ago. Rachel felt sorry. And Rachel might have been the one who made the 911 call. I kept thinking about what Rachel might be sorry for. Sorry for leaving? Sorry for not staying in touch? Or sorry for something else? I went back to Derek. If Derek was harassing Rachel, if Rachel felt threatened, what would she do? She filed a police report, but it didn't help. She left town. But what if Derek followed her? I searched for any records of Derek Pullman outside of the immediate area. Nothing. But if Derek was using a different name, or if he was off the grid, there would be no records. I thought about Derek's disappearance. He filed a report saying he felt threatened. Then he vanished. His car was never found. His accounts were closed. What if Derek didn't leave voluntarily? What if someone made him leave? I called Sarah Linden. I asked if they'd ever considered that Derek might be dead. She said yes. She said it was a possibility they'd explored. She said they'd searched areas where a body might be hidden, but found nothing. She said without evidence, they couldn't pursue it further. I asked if they'd searched the rail yard. She said yes. She said they'd searched the area after Claire disappeared, but found nothing connected to her or Derek. I asked if they'd searched the payphone location. She said they had. She said there was nothing there, just the empty pad where the phone used to be. I went back to Elm and 3rd. I stood on the empty pad again. I looked around. The dry cleaning shop, the closed storefront, the office building, the rail yard 2 blocks away. I tried to imagine Rachel standing here making calls late at night. I tried to imagine what she was seeing, what she was feeling. Then I looked down. The concrete pad, 4 bolt holes, a faded outline. I crouched down. I looked at the bolt holes. 3 of them were filled with old concrete, probably from when the phone was removed. But one of them was different. It was cleaner. The concrete inside looked newer. I took a photo. I sent it to Sarah Linden. I asked if the police had ever examined the pad closely. She said she didn't know. She said she'd send someone to check it out. 2 hours later, Sarah called me. She said they'd sent a crew to the site. She said they'd examined the bolt hole. She said the concrete inside was newer than the others. She said they drilled into it. Underneath, they found something. A small plastic bag. Inside the bag was a folded piece of paper. Sarah said she'd send me a photo of the paper. It came through a minute later. I opened it. The paper was a note, handwritten, the same neat script as the postcard. It said, "He followed me. I didn't know what else to do. I'm sorry. October 12th. I stared at the note. October 12th, the day Claire disappeared. Rachel had hidden this note under the payphone. Or someone had. I called Sarah. I asked if they could test the note for fingerprints or DNA. She said they were already processing it. She said it would take time, but they'd know soon. I asked what she thought it meant. Sarah said it sounded like a confession. She said it sounded like Rachel was admitting to something. She said, "He followed me" could mean Derek. She said I didn't know what else to do could mean Rachel did something to stop him. I asked if she thought Rachel killed Derek. Sarah said it was possible. She said if Derek was threatening Rachel, and Rachel fought back, it could explain why both Derek and Rachel disappeared. She said Rachel might have gone on the run because she was scared of being caught. But I kept thinking about Claire. The note said October 12th. That was the day Claire disappeared, not the day Derek disappeared. Derek disappeared the next day. So what did the note mean? I called Lauren again. I told her about the note. She was quiet. Then she said, Rachel wouldn't hurt anyone. She was scared, but she wasn't violent. I asked if Lauren was sure. She said yes. She said Rachel always tried to de-escalate situations. She said Rachel would run before she'd fight. I asked if Rachel ever mentioned Claire Dawson. Lauren said no. I asked if Rachel ever mentioned being near the rail yard on October 12th. Lauren said she didn't know. She said Rachel didn't give her details about that time. I hung up and thought about the note. He followed me. Derek followed Rachel. I didn't know what else to do. Rachel did something. October 12th, the day Claire disappeared. What if Derek wasn't following Rachel that night? What if he was following Claire? And Rachel saw it. I pulled the map, the rail yard, the payphone, the packaging plant. Claire would have walked from the plant past the rail yard toward the payphone area on her way home. If Derek was following Claire and Rachel was at the payphone, Rachel would have seen it. What if Rachel tried to intervene? What if something happened? What if Claire got hurt? And Rachel panicked. I called Sarah. I told her my theory. She said it was plausible. She said if Rachel witnessed something happen to Claire, it would explain why she left town. She said it would also explain the note. She said Rachel might have been confessing to not helping or to not reporting it right away. I asked if they'd found any evidence of Claire being hurt near the payphone. Sarah said no. She said they'd searched the area thoroughly after Claire was reported missing. She said there was no blood, no signs of a struggle, nothing. I asked if they'd checked the rail yard. Sarah said yes. She said they'd searched it, but it's a large area, and if something happened there, it might have been missed. I went back to the rail yard. I walked the perimeter. I looked for any place someone could hide a body, or any place a struggle might have happened. The yard was full of freight cars, stacks of materials, equipment. There were 100 places something could be hidden. I talked to Luis again, the night crew worker. I asked if he remembered the night of October 12th, 5 years ago. He said no. I asked if he remembered anything unusual around that time. He said the only unusual thing was the guy who used to hang around stopped coming. I asked if he ever saw anything else strange. Luis thought about it. He said one time, maybe a few weeks before Claire disappeared, he saw two people arguing near the fence. He said it was late, and he couldn't see them clearly. He said one of them sounded like a woman. He said they were loud for a few minutes, then they left. I asked if he reported it. Luis said no. He said people argued sometimes. It wasn't his business. I asked if he could describe them. He said just silhouettes. One taller, one shorter. He said the taller one might have been wearing a jacket. I asked which direction they went. Luis pointed toward the street, toward Elm and 3rd. I went back to the payphone location. I stood there and tried to imagine the scene. Rachel at the payphone, Claire walking home, Derek following her, an argument. Then what? I walked toward the rail yard. I followed the route Claire would have taken. Past the fence, past the stacks of materials. Then I saw something, a gap in the fence. It was small, partially hidden by overgrown weeds. I crouched down. The gap was just big enough for a person to squeeze through. I went through. On the other side was a narrow space between two freight cars. The ground was dirt, packed down from years of weathering. I looked around. There was trash, old metal scraps, nothing unusual. Then I saw a piece of fabric caught on a bolt. It was faded, torn, but it looked like it might have been dark blue or black. I took a photo. I called Sarah. I told her what I found. She said she'd send a team. She said they'd process the area. The team arrived an hour later. They searched the space between the freight cars. They collected the fabric. They searched the surrounding area. Then, one of the officers called Sarah over. He was pointing at the ground near the back of one of the cars. Sarah called me. She said they found something. She said it was bone, human bone. She said they were bringing in cadaver dogs and a forensic team. She said it would take time to excavate and identify, but it was significant. I sat in my car and waited. Hours passed. The sun set. The rain started again. Finally, Sarah called. She said they'd found remains. She said they were human. She said preliminary examination suggested they'd been there for several years. She said they'd need to do DNA testing to confirm identity, but the clothing fragments matched the description. of what Claire Dawson was last seen wearing. I felt my chest tighten. Claire, she'd been there the whole time, just yards from where she disappeared, hidden in a gap that no one thought to search thoroughly. I asked if there were signs of trauma. Sarah said yes. She said the medical examiner would need to do a full analysis, but there were signs of blunt force trauma to the skull. She said it looked like Claire had been struck, possibly killed, then hidden. I asked if they found anything else. Sarah said they found a second set of remains, smaller bones, partially buried under Claire's. She said they'd need to identify them, but based on the location and condition, they believed it was Derek Pullman. 2 bodies, Claire and Derek, both hidden in the same place, both dead for 5 years. I asked how Derek died. Sarah said preliminary examination suggested strangulation. She said there were signs of a struggle. She said it looked like Derek was killed shortly after Claire. I sat with that information. Claire was struck and killed. Derek was strangled, both hidden together. Who did it? Rachel. It had to be Rachel. She was there. She left the note. She disappeared. She sent the postcard saying she was sorry. But Sarah said Rachel wasn't violent. Lauren said Rachel would run, not fight. So what happened? I called Sarah. I asked if they'd found any evidence linking Rachel to the scene. She said they were processing everything. She said they'd found some hair fibers that might be testable. She said they'd found some fingerprints on a metal piece near the bodies. She said they were running them through the database. I asked if Rachel's prints were in the system. Sarah said they were checking. She said if Rachel had ever been fingerprinted for a job or a background check, they'd have them. I waited. 2 days later, Sarah called. She said the fingerprints matched Rachel Cody. She said Rachel had been fingerprinted years ago for a job. She said the prints found at the scene were Rachel's. I asked what that meant. Sarah said it meant Rachel was at the scene. She said it didn't prove Rachel killed anyone, but it placed her there. I asked if they'd issued a warrant for Rachel. Sarah said yes. She said they were searching for her. She said if she was alive, they'd find her. But I kept thinking about the 911 call, 2 years after the deaths, 2 years after Rachel disappeared. Why wait? Why make the call from a spoof number, using an address that seemed random? Unless it wasn't random, unless Rachel was trying to tell someone where to look. But the address was Angela Marsh's house, not the rail yard. So why that address? I went back to Angela. I called her again. I asked if she'd ever been near the rail yard. She said no. I asked if she'd ever been to Elm and 3rd. She said maybe. She didn't remember. I asked if the number 1247 meant anything in relation to the rail yard. She said no. I kept thinking about the numbers. 1247 Brookline Road. October 12th, 11:47 p.m. The call was 2 years after the deaths. 2 years. Why 2 years? Then it hit me. 2 years was the statute of limitations for certain offenses, but murder has no statute of limitations. So that wasn't it. Unless Rachel was waiting for something else, waiting for Derek to be declared legally dead, waiting for the case to go cold, waiting for the right moment to confess, I pulled everything I could find on legal procedures around death declarations and missing persons. In most states, a person can be declared legally dead after 7 years of absence. Derek had only been missing for 5 years when the 911 call was made, so that wasn't it either. I kept coming back to the call itself, the voice, the message, the calmness. It didn't sound like someone confessing out of guilt. It sounded like someone reporting a fact. Then I thought about the postcard. I'm sorry. Not I'm guilty. Not I did it. Just I'm sorry. What if Rachel wasn't apologizing for killing anyone? What if she was apologizing for not stopping it? Or for not reporting it sooner? Or for running away? I called Sarah Linden. I told her my theory. She said it was possible. She said if Rachel witnessed the deaths but didn't cause them, she might still feel responsible. She said running and hiding for years would be consistent with fear, not guilt. But I asked who else could have done it. Sarah said they were looking at every possibility. She said maybe there was someone else at the scene that night, someone they hadn't identified yet. I thought about Lewis's statement. He saw 2 people arguing near the fence, one taller, one shorter. What if it wasn't Rachel and Derek? What if it was Claire and Derek, and Rachel showed up after? I went back to the rail yard. I talked to Luis again. I asked him to think harder about the night he saw people arguing. He said it was years ago. He couldn't be sure. I asked if one of the voices sounded scared. He said maybe. He said one of them was louder, more aggressive. The other was quieter, defensive. I asked if he heard what they were arguing about. Luis said no. He said he only heard raised voices. Then they stopped. He said he went back to work and didn't think about it again. I asked if he saw anyone else that night. Luis said no. But then he paused. He said there was a car parked on the street near the fence that night. He said he noticed it because it was unusual to see a car there that late. I asked what kind of car. Luis said a sedan, dark color. He said he didn't get a plate number. A dark sedan. The same description the neighbor on Brookline Road gave. The car that parked on the street late at night, around the time of the 911 call. I asked Sarah if they'd traced any vehicles connected to Rachel, Claire, or Derek. She said Claire didn't own a car. She said Derek's car was never found. She said Rachel had a car registered to her 5 years ago, but it was reported abandoned in a different state about 4 years ago. She said they'd recovered it, processed it, and found nothing. I asked what kind of car Rachel had. Sarah checked. She said it was a dark blue sedan. I felt a chill. Rachel's car, seen at the rail yard the night of the argument, seen on Brookline Road the night of the 911 call. But Rachel's car had been abandoned 4 years ago, a year after she disappeared. So who was driving it 2 years ago? Sarah said she'd look into it. She said if the car had been sold or transferred, there would be records. She called me back an hour later. She said the car was never sold. She said after it was processed, it was auctioned off by the state. She said it was purchased by a man named Thomas Brennan. I asked who Thomas Brennan was. Sarah said she was running a background check. She called back 20 minutes later. She said Thomas Brennan was a mechanic who bought impounded and abandoned vehicles at auction, fixed them up, and resold them. She said he had no criminal record. She said he lived about 30 miles away. I asked if they'd contacted him. Sarah said they were on their way to his address now. She said she'd call me after they talked to him. I waited. An hour later, Sarah called. She said Thomas Brennan confirmed he'd bought Rachel's car at auction 4 years ago. She said he'd fixed it up and sold it about 3 years ago to a woman who paid cash. She said he didn't remember her name, and he didn't keep good records. She said he described her as average height, dark hair, quiet. I asked if it could be Rachel. Sarah said possibly. She said if Rachel bought her own car back, it would explain how she was able to make the 911 call from a location near the rail yard. She said it would also explain the car seen on Brookline Road. But it didn't explain why Rachel would do that. Why buy back your own car? Why risk being seen? Unless Rachel needed to be mobile, needed to stay hidden, needed a car that couldn't be traced back to her current identity. I asked Sarah if they'd found any current records for Rachel. She said no. She said Rachel had no active bank accounts, no employment records, no social media, no phone. She said Rachel was living completely off the grid. I asked if that was even possible. Sarah said it was difficult, but possible. She said if Rachel was using cash, staying in motels or rentals that didn't require background checks, avoiding cameras, she could stay hidden for years. But 2 years ago, Rachel made the 911 call. She used a spoofed number. She gave an address. She said someone was hurt. Then she disappeared again. I kept thinking about the address, 1247 Brookline Road, Angela Marsh's house. The calls Angela received, asking for Claire. Rachel made those calls. But why? I called Angela one more time. I asked if she'd ever done anything that might connect her to the rail yard or the payphone area. She said no. I asked if she'd ever worked in that area. She said no. I asked if anyone she knew had. Angela said wait. She said her sister used to work at a clinic near there. She said her sister was a nurse. She said the clinic closed years ago, but her sister used to talk about the area. I asked if her sister knew Rachel, Claire, or Derek. Angela said she didn't know. She said she could ask. I said please do. Angela called me back 10 minutes later. She said she talked to her sister. Her sister said she didn't remember anyone named Rachel or Derek. But she said she remembered Claire. She said Claire came to the clinic once, about a month before she disappeared. She said Claire had bruises on her arms. She said Claire said she'd fallen, but the sister didn't believe her. She said she asked Claire if someone was hurting her. Claire said no, but she seemed scared. I asked if the sister reported it. Angela said no. She said Claire was an adult, and she refused help. The sister said she gave Claire information about shelters and hotlines, but Claire never came back. I asked where the clinic was. Angela said it was on 3rd Street, just 2 blocks from the payphone. 3rd Street, near the payphone, near the rail yard. Claire went to a clinic there. Angela's sister worked there. Angela's address was used in the 911 call. The connection. Rachel knew Angela's sister. Or Rachel saw Claire at the clinic. Or Rachel was trying to point to the clinic, but used Angela's home address instead because the clinic was closed. I called Sarah. I told her about the clinic. She said she'd look into it. She said if Rachel had any connection to the clinic, it might explain the address. Sarah called back an hour later. She said the clinic had closed 6 years ago. She said the records were archived. She said they were pulling them to see if Rachel's name appeared anywhere. She said it would take time. I couldn't wait. I went to the old clinic location. It was an empty storefront now. The sign was gone. The windows were papered over. I looked through a gap in the paper. Inside was empty. Dust. Old furniture. Nothing. I went next door. A convenience store. I asked the clerk if he remembered the clinic. He said, yeah, it closed a long time ago. I asked if he remembered a nurse who worked there. He said there were a few. I asked if he remembered any patients. He said no. He didn't pay attention. I left and sat in my car. I pulled up the address. The clinic was 1247 3rd Street, not Brookline Road, 3rd Street. 1247. The same number. Rachel didn't use Angela's address randomly. Rachel used the number 1247 because it matched the clinic. But the clinic was on 3rd Street, not Brookline Road. So Rachel added Brookline Road to point somewhere else, or to confuse, or to protect someone. I called Sarah. I told her. She said the clinic address was significant. She said if Claire went there for help, and Rachel knew about it, Rachel might have been trying to create a connection. She said the problem was they still didn't know where Rachel was. I thought about the postcard, the lake, the mountains, generic, but it had to be from somewhere. I looked at the image again. I ran it through a reverse image search. It was a stock photo, sold in dozens of tourist shops across the country. But the postmark, October, 2 years ago. I zoomed in again. I could barely make out the city name. It looked like it started with an L, maybe Lakeside or Lincoln or something similar. I sent the image to Sarah. I asked if she could have the lab enhance it. She said she'd try. She called back the next day. She said the lab enhanced the postmark. The city was Lakeport, a small town about 6 hours north. She said they were sending officers there to check motels, campgrounds, anywhere Rachel might have stayed. I asked if I could go. Sarah said no. She said it was an active investigation and I needed to stay out of the way. She said she'd call me if they found anything. I waited. 3 days later, Sarah called. She said they'd found Rachel. She said Rachel was living in a small cabin outside Lakeport. She said Rachel had been there for almost 4 years, working under the table at a diner, paying rent in cash. She said Rachel didn't resist when they brought her in. I asked if Rachel confessed. Sarah said yes and no. She said Rachel told them what happened, but it wasn't what they expected. Sarah said Rachel told them she was at the payphone the night Claire disappeared. She said she was making a call to her friend Karen when she saw Claire walking past the rail yard. She said she saw a man following Claire. She recognized the man as Derek, the man who'd been harassing her. She said she hung up the phone and followed them. Rachel said she saw Derek grab Claire near the fence. She said she heard Claire scream. She said Derek hit Claire, and Claire fell. Rachel said she ran toward them. She said she yelled at Derek to stop. Derek turned and saw Rachel. He started walking toward her. Rachel said she was terrified. She said Derek was bigger, stronger. She said she didn't know what to do. Rachel said she picked up a metal pipe that was lying on the ground. She said when Derek got close, she swung it. She said she hit him in the head. He fell. Rachel said she checked on Claire, but Claire wasn't breathing. Rachel said she panicked. She said she didn't know if Derek was dead or just unconscious. She said she dragged both bodies into the gap between the freight cars and covered them with debris. Rachel said she went home, packed a bag, and left town that night. She said she knew what she'd done. She said she knew the police would think she killed both of them. She said she couldn't prove it was self-defense. She said she ran because she was scared. Sarah said Rachel also explained the 911 call. She said 2 years after it happened, Rachel couldn't live with the guilt anymore. She said she wanted the bodies to be found, but she was too scared to turn herself in. She said she bought back her old car so she could drive to the area without being traced. She said she used a spoofing app to make the call from the payphone number because that's where it all started. She said she used the clinic address numbers with Brookline Road because she couldn't remember Angela's sister's name. But she remembered Angela received the calls asking for Claire, and she thought if the police investigated, they'd eventually connect it back to the clinic, back to Claire, back to the rail yard. Rachel said she drove to Brookline Road after making the call because she wanted to see if the police would actually respond. She said when they did and found nothing, she drove back to Lakeport and waited. She said she thought eventually someone would figure it out. She said when no one did, she tried to move on, but she couldn't. Sarah said Rachel was being charged with involuntary manslaughter for Derek's death and failure to report Claire's death. She said the DA was considering the circumstances, the self-defense claim, the trauma. She said it would go to trial, but Rachel might get a reduced sentence. I asked if Rachel seemed relieved. Sarah said yes. She said Rachel cried when she told them. She said Rachel said she was tired of running. She said she was ready to face what she'd done. I sat with that for a long time. Rachel wasn't a killer. She was someone who tried to save Claire and ended up taking a life in the process. She was someone who carried that weight for 5 years, alone, scared, guilty. She was someone who tried to make it right in the only way she knew how, even if it was 2 years too late and too complicated for anyone to understand without digging. The rain finally stopped. I went back to Elm and 3rd one last time. I stood on the empty concrete pad where the payphone used to be. The bolt holes were still there, the outlines still faded. I thought about Claire, walking home from her shift, tired, scared, just wanting to get home. I thought about Derek, obsessed, dangerous, following her into the dark. I thought about Rachel, hearing the scream, making a choice in a moment of terror that would define the rest of her life. The case was solved. The bodies were found. Rachel was in custody. But it didn't feel like closure. It felt like a long, exhausting exhale after holding your breath for years. Claire's family was notified. They held a small service. Derek's sister was notified. She didn't attend. Rachel's sister visited her in custody. She said Rachel looked different, older, quieter, but also lighter, like a weight had been lifted. The 911 call that started this, the impossible call from a phone that didn't exist, turned out to be exactly what Helen the dispatcher thought. A message, a confession, a desperate attempt by someone who couldn't come forward but couldn't stay silent. I recorded all of this. I documented every step. I don't know if it was worth it. The months of digging, the dead ends, the pressure. But Claire Dawson's family has answers now. Rachel Cody has a chance at something resembling peace. And Derek Pullman's story serves as a reminder that obsession, unchecked and ignored, can end in tragedy for everyone it touches. The payphone is still gone. The concrete pad is still empty. But the story it holds, the call it somehow carried 2 years after it was removed, that story is finally told. And maybe that's all any of us can do when the facts don't line up and the timeline breaks. We keep pulling threads until the truth comes out, no matter how long it takes, no matter how impossible it seems. This case is closed, but I'll keep the recording. I'll keep the files. Because somewhere out there, there's another call no one can explain. Another voice no one can place. Another case that doesn't make sense. And someone will need to listen.